Hey guys, tonight we're going to dim the lights and take a slow wander through one of the strangest jobs in medieval Europe. The executioner. Now, I know. That doesn't sound especially relaxing at first glance. Heads on blocks, ropes creaking, all that grim stuff. But tonight we're not here for the gore. We're here for the quiet, weird and deeply awkward reality of what it meant to actually be the guy swinging the axe, or the sword, or in some unlucky corners of Europe. The wheel executioners are one of those historical figures everyone remembers, but nobody really thinks about. We imagine them as masked men, hulking brutes, faceless servants of death. But in real life, they were just people. People with mortgages, or at least medieval versions of them. People with families. People who had to buy bread at the same market as their neighbours, even though their neighbours were actively crossing the street to avoid them. So tonight, let's slide into their world. The dark little houses on the edge of town, the strange family trees, the accidental celebrity status, the fact that, despite being essential to medieval justice, executioners were usually treated like social trash. And don't worry, we'll keep the mood calm. No shouting off with his head. Just a quiet bedtime stroll through a very awkward profession. Let's start with the basic problem. Executioners were essential, but nobody wanted to be near them. Think about medieval justice. This was a world that absolutely loved public punishment. Thieves had their ears cut off. Adulterers might be branded. Traitors were treated to the full, gruesome theatre. And ordinary murderers, well, someone had to hang them. But here's the catch. Everyone agreed that this stuff had to be done, but nobody wanted to be the one doing it. So towns and kingdoms created the role of executioner, a specialist, someone officially tasked with carrying out the messy business of justice. On paper, this sounds straightforward. In reality, it meant living with a permanent stain. Executioners were tainted. They were viewed as unclean, half-cursed, morally polluted. Medieval people believed in the literal transfer of sin. So if you killed criminals for a living, their sins rubbed off on you, which made you spiritually dangerous. So yes, society wanted you, but also wanted you nowhere near their dinner table. Classic medieval logic. So how does someone even become an executioner? Spoiler, you didn't exactly see medieval job postings like wanted experienced decapitator, competitive salary. In fact, most executioners didn't choose the job. It was forced on them. One common route was inheritance. If your father was the executioner, congratulations, so were you. Executioner families existed across Europe, passing the role down from generation to generation. And you couldn't easily escape it, because society never let you forget where you came from. Another route was punishment. Sometimes criminals were offered a deal, be executed, or become the executioner. Imagine stealing a horse, getting caught, and then hearing, well, you can hang tomorrow, or you can start hanging other people instead. Not exactly a glamorous career path. This meant many executioners started out as social outcasts already. Criminals, or children of criminals, were forced into the job that nobody else wanted, which, of course, only deepened the stigma. Executioners didn't live in the middle of town. They weren't invited to join guilds or civic groups. They were pushed to the margins, sometimes literally. In many cities, the executioner's house was placed outside the city walls. The message was clear: you're needed, but we don't want to see you. Other times, they were given houses right by the gallows, which is a great way to guarantee no one ever visits for dinner. And yet, there was a strange kind of half-privilege. Executioners were sometimes given free lodging, tax exemptions, or steady salaries. The job was unpleasant, but it came with perks. In a way, executioners had more job security than most peasants. The crime rate in medieval Europe wasn't exactly slowing down after all. But still, neighbours avoided them, priests hesitated to bless them, and ordinary people crossed themselves when they walked by. Executioners were permanent outsiders. And here's the really strange part. Executioners often raised families, big ones. Despite being despised, executioner dynasties were common. The Sansons in France are the most famous, serving as official executioners of Paris for over 150 years. Whole lineages carved out this odd little niche, generation after generation. Marriage was tricky though. Most respectable families wouldn't let their daughters marry an executioner. So, the solution was usually marry into another executioner family. Over time, this created a weird little social subculture where executioner families only really mixed with each other. Outsider families for an outsider profession. Imagine the family reunions. Uncle so-and-so from Rouen, cousin from Lyon, all comparing notes about their work. It was probably the most awkward small talk in Europe. But what did executioners do when they weren't chopping off heads? Surprisingly, quite a lot. Executioners were usually also torturers. Medieval courts loved examinations by question, meaning torture to get confessions. So the executioner was summoned for that too. Another cheerful entry on the CV. They were also responsible for cleaning up crime scenes, disposing of bodies, and occasionally dealing with stray animals. Basically, they were the medieval equivalent of sanitation workers mixed with police muscle. But executioners also picked up side hustles. Because of their unclean reputation, they ended up handling other dirty jobs. Skinning animals, cleaning cesspits, collecting offal from butchers. Some even acted as unofficial healers. Yes, the very people who tortured you in court might also set your broken leg later. Because why not? Medieval medicine was confusing enough already. This bizarre dual role, both despised and weirdly needed, made executioners into a permanent contradiction. People cursed them in church, then quietly knocked on their door when they needed a medical poultice. And here's where it gets even stranger. Executioners were both hated and kind of famous. Public executions were mass entertainment. Thousands would gather to watch. The executioner was center stage. His skill determined whether the crowd went home satisfied or angry. If he bungled the job, missing the neck, taking multiple strokes, the audience booed. Some even rioted. This meant executioners lived under constant public pressure. They were anonymous nobodies most of the time, but on execution day, they were medieval celebrities. Everyone knew their name, everyone judged their performance, and then afterward, everyone went back to ignoring them. That kind of social whiplash must have been exhausting. Oddly, a skilled executioner could gain a twisted form of respect. If you were known for quick, clean executions, your reputation grew. Criminals might even request you hoping for a merciful death, and the authorities valued you too. A well-trained executioner reduced public unrest. So, despite the stigma, there was job security and a grudging acknowledgement that you were good at your work. But at the end of the day, you were still the guy nobody wanted to touch. So let's pause here. We've set the stage. Executioners lived on the edge of town. They inherited their jobs like a curse. They married other executioners' kids. They patched wounds by day and severed heads by order. They were at once despised and essential. In the next part, we'll wander deeper into the really awkward details of their family lives, their strange perks, and some individual biographies that show just how odd this profession could get. But for now, picture it. A small house on the outskirts of a medieval town. Smoke rising from the chimney. Inside, an executioner and his family sit at the table, quietly eating supper. Tomorrow, he'll walk into the market and everyone will step aside. But tonight, it's just bread, stew, and the knowledge that his job is both permanent and cursed. Sleepy stuff. So, we left our executioner sitting down to stew in his little house at the edge of town. Tonight, let's step through the doorway and meet the rest of the family. Because yes, executioners weren't solitary bogeymen skulking around. They had wives, children, in-laws, and even a kind of social club. A very, very weird one. First thing to know, executioners rarely married outside their profession. That wasn't by choice. It was because everyone else refused to marry them. Respectable townsfolk didn't want their daughters tied to a man whose hands were considered polluted. Priests discouraged unions with them. Guilds saw them as untouchable. So what did executioners do? They turned inward. Executioner families married each other. Generation after generation, the son of one executioner would wed the daughter of another. Cousins of executioners married cousins of other executioners. Over time, this created a closed subculture that stretched across towns and even countries. Imagine it as a grim medieval LinkedIn. Oh, you're from the France family in Nuremberg. My uncle worked with your cousin in Augsburg. Want to arrange a marriage? It wasn't exactly romantic, but it kept the role going. And what about the kids? Executioner children grew up knowing that their last name was a curse. They were often excluded from games, snubbed in school, or barred from certain trades. So, many of them ended up stuck in the family business. Sons became executioners. Daughters married into other executioner families. Whole lineages formed, sometimes stretching back centuries. This wasn't entirely unique. Other shunned groups in medieval Europe also had hereditary roles, like gravediggers or lepers' families. But executioners were perhaps the most visible. Their stigma was performed in public every time their father climbed the scaffold. Here's where things get ironic. For all the stigma, executioners also had some pretty sweet perks. Towns knew they had to compensate these men for the social isolation. So, executioners often received free housing, sometimes quite decent housing compared to ordinary peasants. They were given tax exemptions or regular salaries paid out of town coffers. And oddly enough, they got special market privileges. In some German towns, executioners were allowed to take condemned criminals' clothes, tools, or even leftover property as part of their pay. Others were given the right to collect animal carcasses, which could be sold or turned into useful materials. Executioners also developed a side business as healers. Yes, you heard that right. Medieval executioners were often known for their surprising knowledge of bones, herbs, and anatomy. After all, when your job is literally breaking bodies on a wheel, you tend to pick up a few things about how joints work. So, while the priest might refuse to shake their hand, ordinary townsfolk sometimes snuck to their doors after dark for a poultice, a salve, or a bone setting, which made executioners this strange paradox: hated in public, sought out in private. Now let's meet a few actual families who turned this job into a full-blown dynasty. The Sansons of France are the rock stars of executioner history. They held the job of executioner of Paris for 6 generations, from the 17th to the 19th century. That's over 150 years of chopping off heads, culminating in the French Revolution, when Charles-Henri Sanson personally executed Louis XVI. Imagine your family business being so entrenched that you end up decapitating the king himself. The Sansons were semi-famous in their own time. They published memoirs, posed for portraits, and even became minor celebrities in Paris, which is funny because centuries earlier, executioners were still treated as untouchable outcasts. By the 18th century, though, the Sansons had achieved a kind of grim prestige. Then there was the France family in Germany. They held executioner posts across southern Germany for generations, weaving marriages with other executioner families. Their name appears again and again in town records, always tied to the scaffold. In some regions, their family controlled the office so tightly that outsiders never even had a chance. And the Meister-Hensel dynasty in Nuremberg shows just how entrenched executioner families could be. They weren't just local officials. They were practically a hereditary caste, with sons trained from childhood to inherit the profession. These families created something unusual, a group of people both despised and indispensable, treated as outsiders, yet clinging to each other through marriage and tradition. Executioner households weren't exactly normal either. Their homes often doubled as workshops. Tools of the trade, swords, axes, branding irons, ropes, were kept close at hand. Some executioners even displayed them, as if daring visitors to comment. Wives of executioners sometimes acted as assistants, helping with record keeping, managing confiscated goods, or even preparing herbal remedies for clients. Children grew up with the sight of execution swords leaning against the wall, a reminder that their father's work was never far away. And yet daily life was surprisingly ordinary. They ate bread, worked gardens, and told stories at night. The difference was that their neighbors always remembered what those hands had touched. Executioner families couldn't escape their reputation. Even when sons or daughters tried to leave the role behind, towns remembered. In many cases, city statutes explicitly barred child executioners from joining guilds or pursuing respectable trades. Once tainted, always tainted. This created an odd kind of hereditary isolation. Executioner families became executioner clans, their social world shrinking to each other. It wasn't unlike a medieval caste system, only smaller and much more awkward. Everyone wanted them to exist. Nobody wanted them close. Let's pause, again on their side hustle as healers, because it's one of the strangest contradictions. Executioners often handled human bodies more than anyone else in society. They broke bones, dissected corpses, and applied torture devices. In a grim way, this gave them knowledge that doctors lacked, so people sought them out for treatments. Executioners became known for their bone-setting skills. If you broke an arm or leg, the hangman might be the one who fixed it. They also brewed herbal salves, passed down through executioner families like secret recipes. And, in one of those deeply medieval quirks, people believed the touch of an executioner carried magical healing properties. The hand that inflicted punishment was also thought to cure ailments. A bit like cosmic balance, the destroyer could also restore. So, yes, you might avoid him at church, but if your leg snapped, you would be suddenly very happy the executioner lived nearby. So here we are, families of executioners living at the edge of towns, marrying only each other, raising children who had no real escape, and turning their curse into a kind of weird, hereditary trade. By day, they carried out the brutal sentences of medieval justice. By night, they made herbal remedies and set bones. Their names became infamous in town records, stitched across generations like dark little family crests. It's a strange picture. On the one hand, despised pariahs. On the other hand, indispensable public servants, locked into their role by stigma, yet surviving and even thriving as dynasties. And in the next part, we'll wander into the even stranger world of executioners as public performers. The way crowds judged their skill, how some became celebrities, and how this role balanced, somewhere between fear, fame and shame. But for now, imagine a sleepy little house just outside the walls of a German town. A family sits inside, father polishing his execution sword, mother tending herbs in a pot, children playing quietly in the corner. Tomorrow, he'll stand on a scaffold before the entire town. But tonight, it's just another ordinary family, evening in an extraordinary household. Let that image drift with you as we keep strolling deeper into the world of the executioner. So, we've sat with executioners in their homes, met their families, and peeked into their strange perks. But let's not forget the main stage of their lives, the scaffold. Because if medieval Europe loved one thing, it was a good public spectacle. And the executioner was the star performer. Public executions were not just punishments, they were events. Entire towns turned out, vendors sold snacks, and children climbed on walls for a better view. It was the medieval version of live television, grisly, moralizing, and uncomfortably entertaining. At the center of it all stood the executioner. Everyone was watching. His every move mattered. He wasn't just killing someone, he was performing justice for the crowd. If he did it well, the audience nodded in grim approval. If he botched it, well, let's just say medieval audiences were not shy about booing. The executioner's job was simple on paper: end a life. But in practice, it was terrifyingly precise. Beheading requires skill. A single clean stroke with a sharp sword or axe. Too shallow, and the condemned screamed and thrashed. Too many strokes, and the crowd lost patience. Hanging also had its risks. Misjudge the rope length, and instead of a quick snap, you get a long, ugly strangling. Burning, breaking, and drowning. Each method carried its own dangers of messing it up. Executioners are trained for years to get it right, but even the best had bad days. And when they did, everyone remembered. Some bungled executions became legendary. In 1541, Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, was condemned under Henry VIII. The poor executioner assigned to her apparently lost his nerve. It took him 11 strokes, yes, 11, to finally kill her. The crowd was horrified, and the executioner's reputation never recovered. Then there's the case of Mary, Queen of Scots, executed in 1587. Her executioner needed 3 blows of the axe to remove her head, and when he finally lifted it aloft, her wig came off, leaving him holding a clump of hair while her head rolled on the ground. Not the dignified ending anyone was expecting. In France, bungled executions sometimes sparked riots. Crowds jeered, threw stones, and even attacked the executioner himself if the condemned seemed to suffer too much. Imagine standing in front of thousands, missing your swing, and then dodging an angry mob. Not exactly a relaxing workday. Because of this, executioners became performers as much as punishers. They practiced their craft, honed their timing, and sometimes even developed little stage presences. In some places, executioners wore distinctive outfits: a red coat in France, a hood in England. Not the cartoonish black mask we imagine today. That's more Hollywood than history, but still something that marked them out. Their names were known. People whispered about them. Criminals prayed. They'd get a good one. And when the moment came, all eyes were on them. It was an odd kind of fame. You were despised in daily life, but on execution day, you were unavoidable. A bungled execution could ruin an executioner's career. If a noble suffered on the block, it was more than embarrassment. It was political disaster. Executioners could be fined, whipped, even dismissed for incompetence. One German executioner in the 16th century, after botching several high-profile cases, was himself nearly executed. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. This pressure explains why executioner dynasties prized skill. Fathers trained sons carefully, axes were sharpened obsessively, and executioners themselves often refused to drink before a job, fearing a slip of the hand, because a good execution could make your name, a bad one could get you killed. Strangely, some executioners became celebrities in their own right. Take Charles-Henri Sanson, the Parisian executioner during the French Revolution. He executed nearly 3,000 people, including Louis XVI himself. Far from being hidden, Sanson became a recognizable figure in Paris, often spotted walking the streets, known to everyone. He even became a subject of gossip. People speculated about his feelings, his family life, and his secret thoughts. He was, in his own grim way, a public figure. In smaller towns, executioners weren't quite so famous, but they were still household names. Everyone knew who the hangman was. Children whispered his name like a ghost story. Adults muttered it when justice was served. It was a reputation you could never escape. Here's where it gets oddly ironic. Executioners were hated as polluted outsiders, and yet the same society admired their skill. People despised them as neighbors, but trusted them to deliver a merciful end. Some condemned criminals even tipped executioners before their deaths, hoping to encourage a quick, clean strike. A bit like bribing your barber, only with much higher stakes. In a way, executioners became both feared villains and strange heroes. The men who delivered justice, but also the men who embodied everything people feared about death. Let's drift, slowly, through what a public execution actually looked like from the executioner's point of view. Morning began with preparations, sharpening the blade, testing the rope, laying out tools. Crowds gathered, murmuring, waiting. Vendors hawked pies, children squirmed, and priests prayed. The condemned was led forward. Sometimes they gave speeches, sometimes they trembled, sometimes they cursed. All the while, the executioner stood, close, anonymous yet central, and then the act, a swing, a drop, a snap. The crowd gasped, cheered, or booed. The body was displayed, the head lifted, the justice complete. For the audience, it was moral theatre. For the executioner, it was another day's work. So let's lean back. Executioners were public performers in a grim play. Their mistakes became infamous. Their skill was grudgingly admired. Their names lingered in whispers long after the condemned were forgotten. They lived the strangest contradiction. Hated by society, yet put on stage in front of it. Invisible in daily life. Unavoidable at the scaffold. Nobodies in private. Celebrities in public. And in the next part, we'll drift into the twilight of executioners. How their role began to fade with changing punishments. How some became almost respected in modern times, and how this strangest of professions slowly disappeared. But for now, picture the crowd dispersing after a day at the scaffold. Vendors packing up, priests leading prayers, children skipping away. And on the scaffold itself, the executioner quietly wipes his blade, collects his tools, and heads home. Tomorrow, he'll be avoided again in the marketplace. But today, for a brief hour, he was the most watched man in town. Sleep on that irony. Medieval justice had been a theatre of pain. Public executions, mutilations, branding, all designed to shock society into obedience. But by the 17th and 18th centuries, thinkers of the Enlightenment began to ask uneasy questions. Was justice about pain or about reform? Should punishment terrify the crowd or rehabilitate the criminal? As these ideas took root, punishments shifted. Torture was banned in many regions. Public executions became rarer. Prisons, workhouses, and transportation to colonies became the new tools of the state. The executioner, once essential, now found his work slowly drying up. In cities like Paris and London, executions were still held in public well into the 18th century. But the mood was changing. Crowds no longer treated them as morality plays. They began to feel more like carnivals. Pickpockets thrived. Vendors shouted. People fainted at the sight of blood. Authorities grew uneasy. Instead of reinforcing the dignity of law, executions were becoming chaotic. By the 19th century, many governments quietly moved executions behind prison walls. For the executioner, this was both relief and loss. No more jeering mobs, no more pressure to perform flawlessly, but also no more stage. The strange celebrity that executioners once held simply vanished. Some executioner families lingered far longer than you might expect. The Sanson family in France carried the post for 6 generations. From the late 1600s to the Revolution, Charles-Henri Sanson, who beheaded Louis XVI, was not a one-off. He was the culmination of a dynasty that had lasted nearly 150 years. His grandson executed nearly 3,000 people during the Revolution, before the guillotine itself fell out of favor. In Germany, the Reindel family produced generations of executioners, known across multiple cities. In Italy, the Mastro Tito of Rome became almost a tourist attraction, executing more than 500 people in his 60-year career. But these families all faced the same end. Once public executions ceased to be regular, dynasties that had passed down skills, blades, and reputations simply withered away. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the figure of the executioner became something else entirely. Not a public villain, but a hidden civil servant. In Britain, the post was still around, though renamed politely as public executioner. Famous names like William Calcraft and later Albert Pierrepoint became known, not through celebrity, but through careful record keeping. Pierrepoint, who served as Britain's chief executioner in the mid-20th century, executed over 400 people, including Nazi war criminals after World War II. He approached the job with clinical precision, timing his drops so the neck snapped instantly. For him, the scaffold was no longer a theatre, it was a solemn duty. And yet, when Britain finally abolished the death penalty in 1965, Pierrepoint retired quietly. His memoir reflected something many executioners must have felt, that the job weighed heavily no matter how routine it seemed. By the late 20th century, most of Europe had abolished capital punishment. The executioner, once visible in every town, once part of everyday fear and gossip, simply ceased to exist. In countries that still practiced executions, the role shifted further into secrecy. No more hereditary dynasties, no more public identities. Today, where executions occur, the identity of the executioner is often anonymous, hidden by law. The days of children whispering, "That's the hangman's house," are gone. The figure has faded from reality into memory and into myth. And yet, executioners have not disappeared entirely from imagination. They haunt folklore, appearing as bogeymen in children's stories. They crop up in ghost tales, forever doomed to swing the blade. And in modern media, from novels to films, the hooded man with the axe remains an instantly recognizable symbol. It is as if society cannot quite forget them. Perhaps because executioners embodied a contradiction we still wrestle with. The human face of state violence, ordinary men doing extraordinary and terrible jobs. So here, at the end of our long drift, let's lean back. Executioners lived double lives, hated and shunned at home, yet indispensable to justice. Feared in the market, yet watched on the scaffold. They married, raised children, worried about money, just like anyone else, yet they carried the terrible burden of death as their profession. They were both outsiders and insiders, despised and necessary, invisible and famous. And then, in time, they simply vanished, replaced by new systems of justice, new philosophies of punishment. But their shadows linger. The next time you read about a public execution or see the black-hooded figure in a film, you are touching that long tradition of men who walked a strange, lonely path. Let's let the story wind down, slowly, like a candle burning low. Imagine the scaffold dismantled, the crowd dispersing, the tools of execution packed away. The last hangman walks home at dusk, no one greeting him, no one thanking him. Just the sound of his boots on cobblestones and the knowledge of the life he's lived. Now imagine, centuries later, his descendants blending quietly into society, no longer marked by their ancestors' trade. The executioner's line finally ends. The stigma fades, and all that remains is the whisper of history. The knowledge that once, whole families lived in the shadows of justice, carrying out the most dreaded task of all. That's the story of executioners. Grim, yes, but also strangely human. Not monsters, not heroes, but men caught in a role society demanded, even as it turned its back on them. So as you close your eyes tonight, drift on the thought of that paradox. The hated man on whom society depended. The celebrity no one would shake hands with. The neighbor you avoided, who carried out the law for you. Executioners, gone now, but never entirely forgotten. Sleep well. Tonight we're drifting into one of history's more uncomfortable footnotes. So, fluff the pillows, dim the lights, and prepare yourself for the oddly fascinating, yet slightly tragic lives of eunuchs. Yes, eunuchs. The men who weren't quite men anymore, yet somehow ended up running half the world's empires. It's one of those strange ironies. You'd think that removing a fairly crucial body part would take you out of the running for power. But in reality, in ancient China, Byzantium, and even bits of the Middle East, eunuchs ended up closer to the throne than most generals, priests, or politicians. Sometimes they were the ones quietly running everything while the so-called emperor was, let's just say, distracted with his hobbies. Now, before we glide deeper, let's set the bedtime vibe, because the world of eunuchs is not all daggers and conspiracies. It's also long dinners, endless court gossip, and some of the most spectacular palace drama you can imagine. But all told in a sleepy, meandering way. So let's float along. We might as well get definitions out of the way first. A eunuch, at the simplest level, is a man who's been castrated, usually young, often against his will, and always for a purpose, because societies don't just do things for fun. Okay, sometimes they do, but this wasn't one of those times. The reasoning was that a man without certain parts was less of a threat. He couldn't have heirs, which meant he couldn't start a dynasty of his own. He wasn't exactly considered a normal man, so he wasn't competing with the virile aristocrats. And most importantly, he could be trusted around women in the palace. Trusted is a strong word, but when you had harems of hundreds of concubines, the last thing a king wanted was some charming young guard sneaking in after hours. So the solution? Eunuchs, an entire class of half-men who were allowed inside the most private, delicate spaces of the empire. And here's the twist. Because they had access, they gained power. More access than generals, more access than priests. They saw the emperor, at his most vulnerable, overheard his late-night ramblings, passed secret notes between concubines, and handled bribes like professional middlemen. Over time, some of them climbed so high that emperors themselves were afraid of them. Not bad for a group of men who technically weren't supposed to matter. Let's float east first. Ancient China had a special fascination with eunuchs. They were around for millennia. The earliest records of Chinese eunuchs go back to the Zhou dynasty, which is almost 3,000 years ago. And from then on, they just kept multiplying, like rabbits. Well, figuratively, obviously. By the time of the Han dynasty, that's around 2,000 years ago, the imperial palace in Chang'an was crawling with them. Hundreds of eunuchs, maybe thousands. They were technically servants, but servants who held the keys to everything. Want to speak to the emperor? You'll need to go through his eunuchs. Want to send a petition? Better make sure a eunuch doesn't lose it, or accidentally place it at the bottom of the pile. Want to know what the emperor actually said at dinner last night? Guess who was pouring the wine? It's not hard to see how this got messy, because once you're the gatekeeper, you become indispensable. The emperor might technically be the son of heaven, but in practice, his eunuchs could decide who got access, whose bribes were accepted, and whose career suddenly went missing. Naturally, some emperors hated this. They would try to clean house, purge the eunuchs, reduce their numbers, but within a generation, they were back, like palace weeds you just couldn't pull out. One particularly famous case was the late Han dynasty, when court eunuchs basically ran the empire into the ground. The emperors were weak, childlike, or distracted, and the eunuchs took advantage. They sold official posts. They manipulated succession. They built entire factions. By the end, people were writing bitter essays about the 10 attendants, a clique of eunuchs who supposedly ruined everything. And while that might be an exaggeration, it also wasn't totally false. The eunuchs had become so powerful that warlords actually blamed them for the collapse of the dynasty. Imagine being a mutilated servant and somehow getting fingered for the fall of one of the world's greatest empires. That's career achievement unlocked. Now, let's drift west to Byzantium, because if China were addicted to eunuchs, the Byzantines made them into an art form. The Byzantine Empire loved contradictions, half Greek, half Roman, half Christian, half pagan throwback, and in their court, eunuchs were considered this weird third gender category. Not quite male, not quite female, something in between, which ironically gave them opportunities that normal men couldn't have. For one thing, eunuchs could rise very high in the church. Since they weren't exactly men, they weren't technically breaking celibacy rules. At least that was the loophole. So you ended up with eunuch bishops, eunuch abbots, and eunuchs running monasteries. Nothing says spiritual authority like a man who's been surgically separated from temptation. And in politics, oh, they flourished. Some of the most powerful Byzantine officials were eunuchs. There was Narses, a eunuch general under Emperor Justinian, who commanded entire armies and actually won battles against the Goths. Which, let's be honest, is not what you expect from a man who couldn't technically continue the family. Line Byzantine eunuchs were also famous for their education. They were trained in rhetoric, theology, and administration. In some ways, they were groomed to be perfect bureaucrats. No airs, no distractions, and lots of book learning, which sounds suspiciously like modern grad students. The flip side, of course, was ridicule. Byzantine writers loved making snarky comments about their soft voices, their smooth faces, and their supposedly scheming personalities. But the fact remains, these half-men, were sometimes the ones signing the emperor's decrees, while the emperor himself was hunting or praying, or having a meltdown. So what was daily life actually like for a eunuch? Let's take a slow walk through the palace corridors. Imagine waking up in a side chamber of the imperial palace. Your job today might be something minor, like supervising the kitchen deliveries, or something major, like carrying a message from the empress to the emperor. Or, if you're one of the higher-ranking eunuchs, you might literally be managing the emperor's diary, deciding who gets an audience and who gets brushed off. The pay could be decent, the perks, incredible. You ate palace food, you wore fine clothes. You had the ear of the most powerful man on earth, and you were basically untouchable by ordinary nobles who both despised and feared you. But there was always a catch. You couldn't have your own family. You couldn't build a dynasty. In societies obsessed with legacy, that was a serious blow. Some eunuchs adopted nephews. Some lavished wealth on monasteries, hoping their names would live on in prayers. But at the end of the day, you were a kind of social orphan. And then there's the physical side effects. Castration before puberty often left eunuchs tall, long-limbed, and smooth-skinned, with voices that never broke. Which sounds fine if you're going for the ethereal look. But in societies that prized manly beards and booming voices, it made you a permanent outsider. So daily life was this mix of privilege and humiliation. You might be dining with the emperor one night and mocked by courtiers the next. It was like being both the most powerful and the most pitied man in the room. We don't often talk about feelings in history, but imagine what this did to a person. Most eunuchs didn't choose their fate. They were castrated as boys, often slaves or prisoners of war, and handed over to the palace as tribute. Some may not have even remembered life before, so they grew up in a world where they were never truly accepted as men, never allowed to marry, and always defined by what had been taken from them. And yet, they found ways to make themselves indispensable. It's oddly tragic, and at the same time, weirdly admirable. Because through sheer political survival skills, some of them ended up shaping entire empires. They were history's ultimate survivors, men without legacies, who nevertheless left enormous footprints. And with that thought, let's ease into our next section. Because eunuchs weren't just bureaucrats. They were also guardians of harems, companions of emperors, and sometimes victims of palace purges when things went wrong. But that we'll drift into next. So let's float forward. We've wandered through China's corridors and Byzantium's candlelit courts, but we haven't yet talked about the job that most people instantly associate with eunuchs, guarding harems. Yes, someone had to keep watch over the emperors, or sultans, or caliphs. Very large, very complicated household of wives, concubines, and potential heirs. And apparently, the only trustworthy candidates were the men who, well, couldn't participate. Picture it, a sprawling palace. Dozens, maybe hundreds, of women in richly decorated quarters, and stationed at every doorway, a quiet figure in long robes, watching, listening, making sure nobody snuck in or out. That was the eunuch's job. On paper, it sounds like punishment. Imagine being surrounded by beauty all day and knowing it's completely off limits. But in practice, it was one of the fastest routes to influence, because the harem wasn't just about romance or sex. It was politics. Every concubine wanted her son to become heir. Every wife wanted more status. Every servant carried rumors. And the eunuchs were right there in the middle of it. Whispered bribes, secret notes, plots between rival consorts. The eunuchs carried it all, which meant, of course, that they could control information. They decided which messages actually reached the emperor. They decided which concubine got a favorable report. And over time, they were the ones steering the politics of succession. Not bad for guys who were technically just doormen. Now, if China and Byzantium gave us the blueprint, the Islamic empires perfected the model. From the Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad to the Ottomans in Istanbul, eunuchs became the nervous system of the palace. The Abbasids loved eunuchs. They used them as bodyguards, messengers, and confidants. Some even commanded armies. And remember, this was the so-called Golden Age of Islam, when Baghdad was the intellectual capital of the world. Behind those scholars and poets and engineers, there were eunuchs ferrying notes, controlling who got audiences with the caliph, and sometimes quietly pulling the strings. But it was the Ottomans who really took things to another level. Their Topkapi Palace in Istanbul housed one of the most famous harems in history. And guarding it all? Eunuchs. Hundreds of them. There were actually two major categories: the white eunuchs and the black eunuchs. The white ones were usually of European or Mediterranean origin. Greeks, Slavs, or Caucasians captured in war or tribute. They handled administrative duties. The black eunuchs, often from East Africa, were in charge of the harem itself. And yes, the racial division was deliberate. The sultans figured that African eunuchs, being culturally outside the Ottoman elite, were more trustworthy to guard the harem, less likely to sneak political favors to their relatives, which is a convenient bit of stereotyping. But it stuck. The most powerful eunuch in the Ottoman court was the chief black eunuch, known as the Kislar Asa. And despite the unglamorous job title, this man had astonishing influence. He managed the imperial harem, controlled communication between the sultan and his women, supervised the education of royal princes, and even had a hand in religious endowments across the empire. In other words, if you wanted anything done in Istanbul, you probably had to slip a bribe to the chief eunuch first. We should pause here to point out that the harem wasn't a place of idle lounging. It was a serious political battlefield. Concubines maneuvered to have their sons recognized as heirs. Mothers of princes wielded enormous influence. And the eunuchs, moving quietly through the corridors, were the referees, messengers, and sometimes secret players. Take the so-called Sultanate of Women, a period in the 16th and 17th centuries when Ottoman sultans were often weak or disinterested, and their mothers or consorts effectively ruled the empire. Who made that possible? The eunuchs, of course. They acted as intermediaries, carrying orders from the harem women to the divan, the imperial council. It's hard to overstate just how strange this was. The most powerful empire in the world was sometimes being run by a triangle: an anxious sultan, a forceful queen mother, and the eunuchs shuttling notes between them. Diplomats arriving from Venice or Persia often commented, sometimes bitterly, that they had to negotiate with eunuchs instead of the sultan himself. So yes, behind every grand vizier and every imperial campaign, there was probably a eunuch making. Things tick. Let's slow walk through a few individuals because their biographies read like bedtime stories gone slightly wrong. One was Badr al-Jamali, an Armenian slave who was castrated, brought to Cairo, and rose through the Fatimid court. By the late 11th century, he wasn't just a eunuch official. He was the vizier, effectively the prime minister, and military commander. He saved the Fatimid dynasty from collapse, restructured the army, and rebuilt much of Cairo. A man technically unqualified to start a family ended up rebuilding a capital. History has a sense of irony. Another was Kislar Asa, Hacı Beşir Ağa in the Ottoman Empire, 18th century. He began as a black eunuch slave, rose through the ranks, and became the chief eunuch under Sultan Ahmed III. Bashir Ah managed imperial charities, mosque construction, and harem politics. He was so powerful that European ambassadors regularly courted his favour, all from a position that technically existed just to watch the door. And then there's Narses, the Byzantine eunuch general we mentioned earlier. Born a slave, castrated young, and yet he rose to lead armies against the Goths in Italy. By his 70s, this supposedly delicate eunuch was still commanding troops and winning battles, which puts most gym bros to shame. All of this raises the same strange paradox. Eunuchs could be powerful, they could be rich, they could live in palaces and command armies, but they could never pass that power on. No children, no dynasty, no one to carry their name. In a world obsessed with family and inheritance, this made them anomalies. Some adopted nephews or protégés, others endowed religious schools or charities to immortalize their names. But deep down, they knew that their influence ended with them, and maybe that's why they often played so aggressively in politics. When you don't have heirs to protect, you can gamble everything on the present. No son to inherit, no daughter to marry off, just you, your survival, and whatever wealth or authority you can accumulate in your lifetime. It made eunuchs both extremely useful and extremely dangerous. They had nothing to lose, and nothing to tie them down. Let's return briefly to the daily rhythm, because we tend to picture them as shadowy figures lurking in hallways, but they had actual jobs, often crushingly boring. A harem eunuch might spend the day escorting a concubine from one courtyard to another, checking deliveries of fabric or perfumes, or monitoring the palace kitchens. They supervised servants, wrote reports, and managed palace accounts. Many were trained in multiple languages, since they were dealing with ambassadors and foreign slaves. At night, they slept in quarters attached to the harem, effectively living inside the palace bubble. Some probably developed close relationships with the women they guarded, part confidant, part servant, part older brother figure. Others became corrupt, selling favors, or cruel, enforcing rules harshly. It wasn't glamorous, but if you played the game well, it could lead to immense influence. Of course, there's no way to tell this story without acknowledging the darker side. Castration was rarely voluntary. Boys were taken as slaves, mutilated, and sold into palace service. Mortality from the operation was high. Some didn't survive childhood. Those who did often faced ridicule and alienation outside of palace walls. Even for the powerful ones, there was loneliness. Without family, without children, many eunuchs ended their lives surrounded by wealth but lacking any real legacy. Their names live on in history books, but in their own time they were anomalies, necessary, feared, but never fully accepted. So, while we can chuckle at the absurdity of emperors being manipulated by their eunuchs, it's also worth remembering the price these men paid. They were both indispensable and expendable. So far, we've wandered through harems, courts, and battlefields, meeting eunuchs who guarded concubines, ran empires, and sometimes even commanded armies. In our next drift, we'll take a slower look at the cultural attitudes toward eunuchs, how writers described them, how societies mocked or feared them, and how their ambiguous identity made them both insiders and outsiders at once. But for now, let's let that thought linger. So, we've met the eunuchs in their palaces. We've followed them through harems, military campaigns, and bureaucratic offices. But what did ordinary people actually think of them? Because being a eunuch wasn't just about the job. It was about how society labeled you. You were visible. Everyone knew what you were, and that brought a whole mix of mockery, suspicion, admiration, and fear. The most common perception was that eunuchs weren't real men. Writers across cultures loved to describe them with a kind of sneer. They were half men, neither man nor woman, or sometimes creatures of the third sex. Which sounds progressive, but was mostly meant as an insult. Their bodies made them stand out. If castrated before puberty, eunuchs often had smooth skin, no facial hair, high voices, and sometimes a plumpness caused by hormonal imbalance. Poets in Byzantium compared them to women. Chinese chronicles mocked their lack of masculine vigor. And in the Ottoman world, European visitors often gossiped about their eerie appearance in silk robes. It was a paradox. The same societies that elevated eunuchs to positions of power also never let them forget that they were fundamentally other. Religion, of course, had a lot to say about eunuchs. In Christianity, the Bible itself mentions them. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus speaks of those who made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. Early Christians sometimes interpreted this literally, and a few overzealous converts even castrated themselves, though the church quickly banned the practice. In Byzantium, eunuchs were seen as almost ideal churchmen. No risk of scandalous affairs, no heirs to inherit wealth, nothing to distract them from piety. Monasteries sometimes preferred eunuch abbots because they were thought to be more pure, which, considering how much political scheming they also did, is unintentionally hilarious. In Islam, eunuchs were tolerated because they served practical purposes in the harem and mosque. The Quran doesn't explicitly forbid them, and some even managed religious endowments. In Mecca, eunuchs famously guarded the Kaaba for centuries, forming their own small brotherhood. Pilgrims knew them as the strange, soft-voiced figures who kept order at the holiest site in Islam. So while religions often labeled them unnatural, they also carved out sacred niches for them, which again shows that hypocrisy is the most universal human tradition. If you really want to know what people thought, you look at gossip and stories. And eunuchs were constant targets. Chinese plays often portrayed them as scheming villains, whispering in the emperor's ear, plotting against loyal ministers, selling offices for bribes. It was a cliché. If a dynasty was falling apart, a eunuch was probably to blame. Byzantine writers made them into caricatures. Chronicles described them as effeminate, vain, addicted to perfumes and silks. Satirical poems mocked their high voices, and yet the same texts admit, grudgingly, that they were brilliant administrators. In the Ottoman Empire, European travelers wrote long letters about the terrifying black eunuchs of the harem. They were fascinated and disturbed. To a Venetian diplomat, there was nothing more humiliating than having to bow before a man who wasn't even considered fully male. So of course, the diplomats vented their bitterness in letters home, describing the eunuchs as tyrants, corrupters, or simply grotesque. The irony is that these stereotypes didn't stop people from bribing them constantly. If a eunuch was your only path to the throne, suddenly his unnatural body didn't matter quite so much. Let's drift into a few quirky biographies, because they help bring the stereotypes to life. Wei Zhongxian in Ming China was one of the most notorious eunuchs of all time. He started as a gambler, was castrated after getting into trouble, and somehow clawed his way up through the court. By the 1620s, he controlled the young emperor like a puppet. He forced people to worship him in temples, executed rivals, and had officials beaten to death. Basically, He was the ultimate nightmare version of the scheming eunuch stereotype. When the emperor died, Wei's enemies turned on him, and he ended his life by suicide. A spectacular rise, and an equally spectacular fall. Then there's Peter the Patrician in Byzantium. He was a eunuch official who rose to be chief minister under Justinian. Unlike the generals, he wasn't swinging swords. He was negotiating treaties, drafting laws, and quietly managing the empire's paperwork. Writers mocked him for his smooth face, but also admitted he was indispensable. He's the perfect example of how eunuchs thrived not by force, but by patience and literacy. And in the Ottoman world, one quirky figure was Mehmed Ağa, a black eunuch who became chief eunuch in the 17th century. He was known for being unusually humble, living simply, and donating most of his wealth to charity, which baffled European diplomats, who expected every eunuch to be a greedy schemer. Instead, Mehmed Ağa spent his fortune restoring mosques and fountains. He died beloved, which is not the usual ending for palace insiders. So not all eunuchs fit the stereotype. Some were indeed villains, others were bookish bureaucrats, and a few were surprisingly kind. The only thing they all shared was the strange accident of their condition. At the heart of it, societies didn't know what to do with eunuchs. On one hand, they feared them. Eunuchs were associated with manipulation, corruption, and unnaturalness. People whispered that they were dangerous precisely because they didn't have the normal distractions of family and sex. They could devote themselves entirely to schemes. On the other hand, they were needed. Who else could guard harems? Who else could be trusted with imperial secrets? Who else could act as loyal servants without the temptation of founding rival dynasties? This ambiguity gave eunuchs their odd, liminal power. They were despised and indispensable at the same time, mocked in literature, praised in official documents, feared by ministers, but treated as confidants by rulers. And maybe that's why their stories are so strange. They lived in the cracks of society, not quite insiders, not quite outsiders, too useful to discard, too unsettling to fully embrace. So, in this section, we've floated through the way people perceived eunuchs as half men, as holy servants, as schemers, as indispensable bureaucrats. We've seen how literature turned them into villains, how religion both condemned and elevated them, and how real eunuchs sometimes lived up to, or subverted, those stereotypes. Next time, we'll keep drifting into the twilight. We'll look at the decline of eunuchs in world history, how technology, changing empires, and modern states gradually made them unnecessary. And maybe we'll ask the sleepy question, what legacy did this peculiar institution really leave behind? But that's for the next section. For now, let's just leave them here, in their silk robes, shuffling down palace corridors, half feared, half pitied, and forever essential. So, we've walked through the palace corridors of China, Byzantium, and Istanbul. We've met schemers, generals, harem guards, and bureaucrats. But all good things, or at least all very strange institutions, eventually come to an end. Eunuchs were not immune to history's biggest spoiler, modernization. The decline of eunuchs wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment where someone declared, "Right, that's it, no more castrated courtiers." Instead, it happened slowly, almost imperceptibly, as empires aged and states changed. Take China. Eunuchs had been a fixture for over 2,000 years. But by the 19th century, the Qing dynasty was wobbling. European powers were knocking at the gates, and the old palace routines started looking outdated. Eunuchs were still there. In fact, thousands of them still served in the Forbidden City. But their influence was a pale shadow of what it had once been. One of the last famous Chinese eunuchs was Sun Yao-ting, who died in 1996. Yes, 1996. Think about that. While the rest of the world was buying dial-up internet, China still had a living relic of imperial eunuchdom shuffling around. He had been castrated as a boy in the early 20th century, hoping to serve the last emperor, Puyi. But history moved too quickly. By the time he reached Beijing, the monarchy had already collapsed. Sun spent the rest of his life as a kind of living museum piece, occasionally interviewed by historians, always reminding people of a vanished world. So, the eunuchs lingered, but modern governments didn't need them. Telegraphs, railroads, and bureaucracies don't require eunuch gatekeepers. The Ottomans, too, eventually let go. The empire limped into the 19th century with its harems and palaces still intact, but the pressure of European reform forced change. By the 1900s, the chief black eunuch's office was basically ceremonial. After the Ottoman monarchy was abolished in 1922, the harem was dissolved and the eunuchs were dismissed. Some of them lived quietly in Istanbul, reduced from palace power brokers to old men selling coffee or telling stories about the past. Imagine being once the most feared doorman in the empire, only to end up explaining directions to tourists. History can be cruel. Byzantium had already bowed out centuries earlier. The empire itself collapsed in 1453, when the Ottomans took Constantinople. By then, eunuchs were still present, but the culture that had glorified them as administrators and generals faded away. Ottoman practices replaced Byzantine ones, and the eunuchs of Constantinople were absorbed into the new system, or simply forgotten. So why did eunuchs vanish? First, because the logic behind them stopped making sense. They were originally needed as safe guardians for harems and as trustworthy courtiers who couldn't start rival dynasties. But once monarchies lost power, harems shrank and modern bureaucracies took over. There wasn't much point. A modern civil service doesn't really need to castrate anyone. It just drowns them in paperwork instead. Second, morality shifted. By the 19th century, castration for court service began to horrify reformers. Even in societies that once accepted it, the idea of mutilating children for palace duty became unacceptable. Empires needed new ways to control their households that didn't involve scalpels. And third, technology changed intimacy. Rulers no longer lived in closed palaces, hidden away behind gates and curtains. They held parliaments, newspapers reported on them, and telegraphs spread their decrees. The cozy palace world where eunuchs thrived was replaced by something much less private. Still, the story has a strange afterlife. The very last eunuchs remind us how long traditions can linger. We mentioned Sun Yao-ting in China, a man who lived through the fall of the Qing dynasty, the warlords, the Japanese occupation, the rise of Mao, and still carried the memory of the Forbidden City. In the Ottoman world, the last palace eunuchs lived well into the 20th century. A few were even photographed, shuffling around Topkapi Palace gardens in robes, looking like ghosts from another century. They ended their lives not as power brokers, but as curiosities. And in Mecca, the Brotherhood of Eunuchs, who guarded the Kaaba, continued in some form until the mid-20th century. Pilgrims remembered their distinctive voices and ceremonial duties. When that tradition ended, it marked the true twilight of eunuchs as an institution. So how do we remember them today? In popular culture, eunuchs often appear as exotic villains, scheming court figures in movies about China or Byzantium, sinister harem guards in Arabian Nights-style tales. or occasionally as tragic side characters, robbed of their humanity for someone else's power. In scholarship, they're increasingly studied as a unique social group, people who defied gender categories, who lived in liminal spaces, and who wielded enormous influence despite their outsider status. Some historians even frame them as early examples of queer history, though of course that's applying modern labels to very different worlds. But mostly, eunuchs survive as a symbol of the weird compromises of old empires. They remind us that power often flows through unexpected channels. Not the generals, not the nobles, not the priests, but the quiet figure in silk slippers who couldn't have heirs. So, let's let the story settle. Eunuchs were once everywhere. In China, Byzantium, Baghdad, and Istanbul. They guarded harems, signed decrees, commanded armies, whispered in emperors' ears. They were feared, mocked, and indispensable. And then, as the world modernized, they simply faded away. It's oddly fitting. Men without legacies ended up leaving almost no legacy themselves, except in history books. The system that had made them necessary dissolved, and they dissolved with it. And yet, for centuries, they shaped the fate of empires. They show us that power doesn't always belong to the obvious players. Sometimes, it belongs to the people you least expect. And that's where we'll leave them tonight. Eunuchs, the half-men of history, shuffling through endless palace corridors, carrying secrets, wielding power, and fading into obscurity. As you drift towards sleep, imagine the echo of their footsteps. Soft leather slippers on marble floors, moving silently between worlds. Not quite men, not quite outsiders, essential and forgotten all at once. So, close your eyes, let the palace gates shut behind you, and drift. History will still be there in the morning. Good night. We're going to wander into the kitchens, or really, the smoky huts, of medieval peasants. It's not glamorous. There are no golden goblets, no royal feasts with swans baked into pies. Instead, we're dealing with gritty bread, suspicious, stews, and whatever could be scraped together to get through the week. So if you're listening in bed, dim the lights, settle down, and prepare yourself for a very slow walk through the diets of people who spent most of their waking lives just trying not to starve. Because food history is strangely soothing. It's repetitive, it's earthy, and in the medieval case, it's just bland enough to lull you to sleep. Let's start with the unavoidable. Bread was everything. For the average medieval peasant, bread wasn't just the side dish. It was the dish. It made up 50–70% of daily calories, depending on the region and the century. This wasn't the fluffy white bread you might be imagining. It was dark, heavy, and dense, often with unmilled grains, bits of husk, or even little pebbles from the grinding stone. Dental records from the Middle Ages show enormous wear on people's teeth, not just from age, but because chewing bread was basically like chewing fine sandpaper. Most peasants ate rye bread, or barley bread, or sometimes a grim mashup of whatever grains were available. Wheat bread, the kind that was baked into a light loaf, was usually reserved for wealthier households. To peasants, white bread was almost mythical, the food of nobles, monks, and special occasions. So, if you picture the medieval week, morning, bread, midday, bread with something on top, evening, more bread, maybe dipped in a broth if you were lucky. Exciting, right? Bread's partner in crime was ale. Not modern hoppy beer, but weak, cloudy ale that functioned as a kind of liquid, bread. It was safer than water, it had calories, and it filled you up. This wasn't an occasional drink. It was the default beverage of the medieval village. Men, women, and children all drank ale daily. But don't imagine little kids stumbling around drunk in the fields. Most ale was small ale, extremely low in alcohol, maybe 1 or 2% at most. Just enough to keep bacteria at bay, but not enough to get anyone tipsy. Still, in the rhythm of the week, every meal likely involved ale. Ale at breakfast, ale at lunch, ale in the evening. If you lived near a monastery or a town, you might occasionally get stronger brews, but for the average household, ale was more about survival than recreation. After bread and ale, the other staple of peasant life was the pottage. This was a kind of thick stew made from grains boiled with vegetables, sometimes flavoured with a scrap of meat if it could be spared. Imagine barley or oats, boiled down until they formed a mush, then bulked out with whatever the garden offered: onions, leeks, cabbage, turnips, herbs if you had them, salt if you could afford it. Pottage was endlessly adaptable. It might be watery on bad days, thick and hearty on good ones. Sometimes people kept a pot simmering over the hearth all week, tossing in new ingredients as they came along, letting old ones stew down to paste. The perpetual stew, as it's sometimes called, was less about culinary flair and more about efficiency. So when we ask, what did peasants eat in a week? The boring but true answer is, they ate the same thing, over and over, until it ran out. Bread, ale, and pottage were the daily drumbeat of medieval life. Now, what about meat? Here's where we run into modern misconceptions. We imagine peasants, occasionally feasting on chickens, pigs, or cows. But in reality, livestock were too valuable to eat casually. Cows gave milk, which could be turned into butter or cheese. Chickens gave eggs. Pigs were often raised for a single annual slaughter, salted and smoked to last the winter. Eating fresh meat in an ordinary week was rare. When peasants did eat meat, it was often small game: rabbits, hares, or birds they could catch in the fields. Sometimes even hedgehogs or squirrels. Yes, hedgehog stew was a thing, and no, it probably didn't taste great. Large animals like oxen or cattle were butchered mostly during feast times or communal events. The average peasant couldn't just butcher a cow because they fancied beef stew. That cow represented months of labour and investment. So in a typical week, meat was not the centerpiece. It was an occasional flavouring, a bone for the pot, or maybe a slice of bacon on a lucky day. Dairy products were more common, especially in rural households. Milk, butter, and cheese supplemented the otherwise grain-heavy diet. Cheese in particular was vital. It could last, it was portable, and it added some much-needed protein. Eggs were another steady addition, though they varied with the seasons. Chickens don't lay well in winter, so eggs might disappear for months at a time. A typical week might include boiled eggs, fried eggs, or eggs beaten into pottage, if the household had hens. Beyond bread and ale, the backbone of peasant food came from the garden. Onions, leeks, cabbage, beans, and peas were the most common. Turnips and parsnips were staples too. These weren't side dishes, they were bulk. A peasant's pottage was essentially a vegetable stew with bread on the side. Fruits were seasonal: apples, berries, and plums. Most wouldn't last long after harvest unless dried. The idea of eating fresh fruit every day just wasn't part of the medieval rhythm. In lean times, people turned to whatever they could dig up: nettles, acorns, even tree bark. Chroniclers sometimes describe peasants boiling grass or weeds during famine years. Not exactly gourmet, so let's imagine a typical peasant household week in and week out. Monday breakfast: stale bread, dipped in ale, midday meal, pottage with cabbage and beans, more bread. Evening, another round of bread, maybe cheese if available, and of course, ale. Tuesday, the same. Wednesday, the same again, with maybe a boiled egg if the hens were laying. If it were summer, there might be a handful of fresh peas or berries tossed into the mix. If it were winter, the meals leaned heavily on dried beans and salted turnips. But the rhythm didn't change much. Only Sundays or feast days broke the cycle. That might mean meat from a pig slaughter or better quality bread made from wheat. Religious feasts often provided excuses for slightly richer meals, and sometimes lords distributed extra rations. But the truth is that most weeks blurred together in a haze of bread, ale, and stewed vegetables. And looming over all of this was hunger. Medieval peasants lived on the edge of subsistence. Bad weather, poor harvests, or greedy landlords could push families into famine quickly. Accounts from the 14th century famine years describe people eating cats, dogs, and even leather to survive. In a normal week, food was monotonous but filling. In a bad year, it was scarce, and the monotony slipped into misery. So when we picture the medieval diet, we should keep that fragility in mind. Food was never guaranteed. Every week carried a quiet anxiety. Would the bread hold out? Would the garden survive the frost? And that's our sleepy start. Bread, ale, pottage, the occasional egg, and the lingering shadow of hunger. Not the most glamorous of diets, but a strangely soothing one to drift through in imagination. So, we've covered the bare bones of the diet. Bread, ale, pottage, the occasional bit of cheese or meat. But food isn't just about survival. It's also about the rhythm of daily life, about how meals were shared, what rules hovered around the table, and how religion constantly meddled with the menu. Let's drift through that slower layer tonight, not just what peasants ate, but how it fit into the culture of the medieval week, the year, and the long, strange shadow of the church. First, let's talk about where and how peasants actually ate. Forget the mental picture of a family sitting around a neat wooden table with pewter plates. Most peasants didn't own tables. Many lived in single-room cottages with a central hearth. Meals were eaten sitting on stools, benches, or simply on the floor. Food was often served in a single communal pot or wooden bowl. Everyone dipped in with their own spoons or tore off hunks of bread to scoop up the stew. Personal plates and forks. Forget it. The knife was the only utensil most people owned, and it was carried at the belt, used for everything from cutting bread to whittling wood to, occasionally, a bit of self-defense. Meals were quiet, practical affairs. There was no expectation of courses. Just whatever was available, served all at once. Bread, a ladle of pottage, maybe a smear of cheese or butter. Then back to work. Children ate alongside adults, though they were expected to. Wait their turn and not hog the good bits floating in the pot. And there was always a strict sense of hierarchy. The father or grandfather might get the choicest portion of meat if there was any, while younger members of the family were left with broth. In other words, dinner wasn't a grand bonding ritual. It was fuel, quickly eaten, often in smoky, dim spaces, and then forgotten until the next meal. Now, let's stretch out from the drudgery into the brighter spots of the calendar. Because while the daily diet was repetitive, the medieval year was dotted with feast days, holy days, and communal celebrations that shook things up. The church calendar was full of festivals: Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, Saints' Days. Each one provided some excuse for lords or monasteries to distribute food to villagers. A feast might mean wheat bread instead of rye, fresh meat from a communal slaughter, or barrels of stronger ale. At Christmas, some villages received special rations from their lord: salted pork, extra cheese, or spiced cakes if the estate could afford it. Easter might come with eggs in abundance, since hens began laying again after the winter lull. Harvest festivals were another high point. After the grueling labor of bringing in the crops, communities often held gatherings with music, dancing, and the best food the year had to offer. It wasn't luxury by modern standards, no fountains of wine or sugared peacocks, but compared to the grinding routine, it was a banquet. So in the rhythm of the peasant year, there were long stretches of monotony, broken by bursts of celebration where diets suddenly expanded. A normal week was bleak, but now and then, life reminded peasants that food could be joyful too. Of course, the church wasn't all generosity. It also imposed strict fasting rules, and those shaped the peasant diet in weird and sometimes frustrating ways. Medieval fasting didn't mean no food at all. It meant no meat, and often no dairy or eggs either. That left fish, vegetables, bread, and ale as the mainstays. And because the church calendar was absolutely packed with fasting days, up to 150 or more per year, this had a huge impact on what peasants ate in an average week. So picture it. On a Wednesday, you might be tucking into a thin vegetable stew because meat was banned. On Friday, it was fish, if you were lucky enough to live near a river or coast. If not, you relied on salted herring or dried fish shipped inland, often at inflated prices. The result was that peasants became remarkably inventive. They found loopholes. Beavers, for example, were sometimes classified as fish since they lived in water. So were barnacle geese, which people believed literally grew out of driftwood. Yes, medieval logic was a flexible thing. Even dairy got weird. In some regions, people made almond milk, essentially ground almonds mixed with water, as a substitute for cow's milk on fasting days. It was mostly an elite food, since almonds had to be imported, but the idea trickled down. So, in a typical week, what you ate might be dictated not just by what you grew, but by what the priest said you were allowed to eat. The church was basically the nutritionist no one asked for. Of course, not all peasants ate alike. Europe was a patchwork of different climates, crops, and customs. England, barley and oats dominated, along with ale. Fish was important, thanks to the long coastline. France. Rye bread was common in the north, while chestnuts bulked up diets in the south. Wine replaced ale in many regions. Germany. Rye was king, along with hearty cabbage stews. In beer-producing regions, stronger brews were more common than elsewhere. Italy, a richer variety, olives, grapes, chestnuts, and more frequent use of beans and lentils. Even peasants there ate more fruit. Scandinavia. Diets leaned heavily on fish, dairy, and hardy grains like rye. Meat from hunting and herding was slightly more common, since arable farming was harder. So, the peasant diet wasn't a single thing. It shifted with geography. A week of eating in Tuscany would have looked very different from a week in rural Poland. But the theme was the same: heavy reliance on grains, vegetables, and seasonal availability. Now let's linger on some of the stranger corners of the medieval peasant diet. Acorn bread. In times of famine, some peasants ground acorns into meal to stretch their bread. The taste was bitter, and it could upset the stomach, but it kept people alive. Blood pudding. Nothing went to waste during slaughter season. Animal blood was mixed with grain to make sausages or puddings, nutritious, if you didn't mind the texture. fish. Galore. Because of fasting, salted fish became almost an obsession. Huge amounts of herring were traded across Europe. A peasant family might eat herring several times a week during Lent, even if they lived hundreds of miles from the sea. Ale soup. Yes, this was a thing. Ale warmed with bread crumbled into it. Essentially, beer porridge. Strange beliefs. Some people thought cabbage had near magical properties, able to cleanse the body of sin. Beans, on the other hand, were sometimes avoided because they were believed to cause melancholy or even summon demons. Quirky, yes. But for peasants, these oddities weren't novelties. They were survival strategies dressed up in a little folklore. So if you drift through the average week of a medieval peasant, you get a kind of rhythm. Monday, bread and ale. Tuesday, pottage. Wednesday, fasting stew. Thursday, bread, cheese, maybe an egg. Friday, fish, if available. Saturday, back to bread and ale. Sunday, a slightly nicer meal, maybe with meat or better bread. It wasn't exciting, but it was steady, and the monotony had its own strange comfort. Food was predictable, rooted in the land and the season. Every year was the same, except when famine or plague interrupted it. It's the kind of repetition that makes for a perfect bedtime drift. A week blending into another. The same meals, the same stews, the same bread. Bland, yes, but also soothing in its predictability. Now let's drift into the less appetizing side of medieval dining, because if we've painted a picture so far of peasants eating bread, broth, and the occasional festive goose, it's only fair to balance the canvas with the long stretches of empty bowls and sour bellies that were equally a part of medieval life. Hunger wasn't some rare event. It was almost a seasonal character in the medieval world, arriving in late spring when last year's grain ran low, sticking around until the new harvest came in, and occasionally overstaying its welcome if the weather went badly. People even had a name for this bleak stretch of time. They called it the lean months. Not exactly subtle, but perfectly accurate. And what did peasants eat when the cupboards were bare? Well, they got creative. The word creative here means things you and I would politely decline even if stranded on a camping trip. One of the most infamous famine foods was something historians call bark bread. No, not some rustic hipster sourdough with artisanal forest flavoring. This was literally mixing tree bark into ground-up grain scraps to stretch the dough further. The bark, usually from birch or pine, had no nutritional value to speak of. It just added bulk. Imagine chewing on a bitter, fibrous cracker that makes your stomach feel full, but doesn't actually feed you. That was the point. Trick the body into thinking it had eaten something solid. Acorns also entered the pot in desperate times. Ordinarily, peasants avoided acorns. They were too bitter and caused stomach upset if not carefully prepared. But famine had a way of lowering culinary standards. People would leach acorns in water for days, then grind them into a rough flour. Mixed with weeds or a pinch of rye, it made a kind of porridge. Reports from the time suggest it was about as tasty as wet cardboard, but slightly more filling. When grains ran out entirely, the fields themselves became dinner. Medieval peasants collected nettles, dandelions, sorrel, goosefoot, and a dozen other plants that today we'd call backyard weeds. These were boiled into thin soups, sometimes with a dash of sour whey, sometimes just plain. A few had surprising health benefits. Nettles, for example, are high in iron. But let's not kid ourselves. A nettle broth was no feast. It was a survival slurp. Even grasses were tried in absolute emergencies. People chewed stalks or ground the roots into rough flour. Chroniclers didn't mince words. Grass flour bread, gave people stomach cramps and offered almost no nourishment. But when it's between eating grass or not eating at all, you choose the grass. During shortages, peasants sometimes turned to meat they normally avoided, not tender cuts of lamb or a nice plump goose, but whatever small, desperate catches they could get. Cats, dogs, and even rats appear in famine accounts. Again, not delicacies, but calories. Some villages quietly tolerated it. Others considered it taboo, but starvation tends to bend the rules. And then there were horses. Normally, horses were too valuable as work animals to slaughter, but during crisis years, horses were eaten, despite the cultural unease it caused. Chroniclers often wrote about horse eating with horror, as if it were a sign that civilization itself was cracking. But if your choice was between watching your family starve or boiling a horse leg, the moral debate got shorter with each hunger pang. Another common survival tactic was lowering one's standards for freshness. Grain that had spoiled from damp, storage, meat that smelled a little too sharp, fish crawling with maggots, all of it still made its way to the pot in hungry times. There's a haunting line in medieval records. They ate what even dogs refused. This gives us a sense of just how low the menu dropped. It's easy to list famine foods like a museum exhibit: bark bread, nettle soup, rancid fish. But it's harder to imagine the constant psychological drag of hunger itself. Medieval peasants lived with it often enough that it became part of their mental landscape. Think about the rhythm of their year. Springtime was often lean, summer a little better, autumn the hope of abundance, and winter the long haul of preservation. But any disruption, a rainy harvest, a frost at the wrong time, or a war passing through, could reset the whole cycle into scarcity. Parents often went hungry so their children could eat. This wasn't an occasional gesture, it was routine. Husbands might hand their meager portion to wives who were pregnant or nursing. Elderly relatives were sometimes the first to quietly step back from the table, pretending they weren't hungry, so the younger ones might live. Food was never just about flavor, it was about survival math. Who gets enough to keep going, and who gets less? Contemporary accounts describe villages where children had swollen bellies from malnutrition, where people grew gaunt and lethargic, and where tempers frayed because constant hunger makes everyone a little brittle. But at the same time, famine didn't always look like an apocalyptic collapse. Often, it was quieter, a long, weary dragging on, meals that grew thinner week by week, jokes around the hearth grew fewer, a community gathering to share a thin pot of nettle broth, everyone pretending it was enough. For peasants, hunger was as much a social condition as a personal one. Everyone suffered together, and the rituals of sharing, giving the last crust to a neighbor, watering down the soup for one more bowl, were part of how people endured. The church, of course, had a role here too. Hunger was sometimes interpreted as a kind of divine test. A famine might be described as a punishment for sin or a call to repentance. Priests encouraged fasting even during shortages, because hunger could be offered up as a holy sacrifice. It's a little bleak, really. Imagine you're already starving, and someone tells you to embrace it as spiritual training. Not exactly comforting, but in some ways, that religious framework did help people endure. If suffering had a purpose, it was at least less meaningless. And yet, for all the gloom, peasants were astonishingly resilient. They learned the art of stretching meals beyond recognition. They shared techniques for leaching acorns or boiling, bones 3, 4, 5 times until there was almost nothing left. They developed the kind of food thriftiness that modern, waste-free kitchens aspire to, but on a level few of us today could manage. When famine ended, when the harvest came in or trade routes reopened, the relief was enormous. Villagers didn't just eat, They celebrated. Bread was blessed, beer was brewed, and suddenly the world seemed rich again. It's hard to overstate how much joy was bound up in the return of food. For a medieval peasant, a loaf of fresh wheat bread after a famine wasn't just a meal. It was the taste of life returning. So that's the darker side of the peasant diet. The lean stretches, the bitter broths, the desperate improvisations that kept families alive. In some ways, it highlights just how fragile medieval life really was. A bad season, and the whole system cracked. But before we close out this sleepy meditation, we should balance the ledger once again. Because medieval eating wasn't all bark bread and nettle soup. It had its joys, its rhythms, and its comforts too. So, let's float toward the final stretch, the daily rituals of food, the sense of community, and the way peasants found meaning in their shared meals, even when those meals were small. We've chewed through the rough crusts of medieval diet, the bread, the ale, the weeds, even the bark. But food in the Middle Ages was never just about calories. It was also about connection, about ritual, about the way meals, however small, bind people together. If there was one constant in the life of a peasant family, it was the shared table. Not a polished dining set, of course, but a rough board, a bench, maybe just the ground around, a fire. The meals weren't long, and they weren't grand, but they were the rhythm of life. Morning porridge before work, a midday pause in the fields for bread and ale, the evening gathering, when everyone came back under the same roof and ate whatever the pot had yielded that day. The hearth was the heart of the household, the place where meals simmered, where smoke curled up through thatched roofs, where families warmed their hands and stretched their legs. And in many ways, the hearth was more than physical warmth. It was emotional security. Even if the food was thin, the act of gathering around the fire and eating together was a reassurance. The day might have been hard. The weather might have been grim. But here, there was fire, there was bread, and there were other people to share it with. We sometimes forget that joy doesn't need abundance. Medieval peasants certainly didn't. A rare bit of butter stirred into porridge could make the whole family smile. A sprig of herbs brightened an otherwise bland broth. The occasional surprise of a rabbit snared in the hedgerow felt like a feast. Children got excited for honeycomb, berries, or roasted chestnuts. Adults cherished their ale, weak though it often was. Even in times of plenty, the peasant diet wasn't glamorous. But precisely because luxuries were rare, the little things stood out all the more. A feast day roast goose wasn't just tasty, it was memorable. It gave people stories to tell, something to look forward to in the next cycle of the year. Food also shaped community identity. Different regions had their flavors, even among peasants. The French villager ate more cheese, the English more ale, the Italians eat more beans and olive oil. These weren't luxuries. They were the natural outgrowth of local land and climate. So, a meal wasn't just family bonding, it was cultural belonging. Eating rye bread in the north or barley bread in the south meant you were part of a place, woven into its soil and its rhythms. Peasant hospitality also mattered deeply. However meager the household supply, a guest was almost always offered food, even if it meant thinner portions for the family. Bread was broken, bowls were shared, and the guest left knowing that they'd been treated with dignity. In famine times, this ritual of sharing grew even more important. A village might pool its scraps, spreading hunger more evenly, so no one family bore it alone. The social contract of the table was what kept communities from unraveling. For medieval peasants, food wasn't just sustenance, it was memory. A good harvest was remembered for years, the year the bread was plentiful, when ale flowed easily, when feasts went on longer than usual. A famine, too, lingered in memory, passed down in stories. That was the year of the bark bread, the year of nettle soup. Parents told children these stories not just to complain, but to remind them of endurance, to mark the cycles of fortune, to say, we've known worse, and we survived. So, what did medieval peasants eat in a week? The simple answer is bread, broth, ale, and whatever else could be coaxed from the soil, the woods, or the generosity of neighbours. Sometimes it was enough, sometimes it wasn't. But the deeper answer is that food was always more than food. It was the glue of family, the pulse of the seasons, the shared sigh of relief when the harvest came in, and the shared silence when it didn't. Peasant meals were small, but their meaning was large. They shaped how people saw the year, how they endured hardship, how they found joy in simple pleasures, and how they stayed connected to each other in a world that often offered very little. And as we let that picture settle, maybe it's worth noting the calmness in it. No clinking silver forks, no courses of banquets, no dizzying variety. Just one pot, one loaf, one fire, and the slow, steady rhythm of eating together. So, as you drift off tonight, imagine that small medieval household, the quiet crackle of the hearth, a wooden spoon passed from hand to hand, bread broken in half, the humble but persistent comfort of food, however modest, and the way it stitched lives together through centuries of hunger and plenty alike. And with that, we can let the story rest. We're easing into one of those corners of history that manages to be both glamorous and quietly tragic at the same time. It's the world of royal mistresses, the women who sat, sometimes uneasily, at the right hand of kings, emperors, and princes. Now, when you picture a mistress in a royal court, it's tempting to imagine silks, jewels, candlelit chambers, and whispered power behind the throne. And yes, those things were often part of the package. But the story doesn't end there, because if life as a royal mistress could begin with dizzying privilege, it often ended with the opposite: isolation, exile, disgrace, or even worse. So tonight, we're going to settle in and drift through that world. The loves, the perks, the fragile security, and the inevitable question: what happened when the king got bored? First things first, it wasn't just about romance. Mistresses were practically an institution in most European courts. For kings, marriages were dynastic contracts, arranged with queens to cement alliances and produce heirs. Love, affection, and attraction, those were supposed to stay politely outside the marriage bed, and so the mistress filled the gap, sometimes openly acknowledged, sometimes hidden in the shadows, sometimes practically treated like a second queen. Queens themselves often had little power to resist this arrangement. A mistress could be their rival, their irritation, or occasionally even their ally. The key point is that mistresses weren't just bed partners. They were often confidants, advisors, and even patrons of art or politics. They could shape policy, or at least nudge it, with a few words in the king's ear. But that power was as fragile as perfume in the air. Becoming a mistress wasn't always glamorous at the start. Many came from the lower nobility, or even from merchant families who saw opportunity in court service. A pretty lady in waiting might catch the king's eye. A court dancer might linger in his memory. A widow with wit and charm might end up in his chamber instead of his council hall. And once elevated, life could change overnight. Fine gowns, personal servants, rooms in the palace, gifts of land or titles. Their families often rose with them. A brother might get a cushy office, or a father might suddenly discover that his debts had been forgiven. But the ladder was fragile. One wrong step, one jealous rival, one turn of the king's wandering attention, and down you went. Let's take a gentle stroll through a few examples. In medieval France, royal mistresses were not yet fully official, but the pattern was clear. Kings married queens for politics, but mistresses were where they sought comfort. Charles VII of France, in the 15th century, had Agnès Sorel, one of the first mistresses to be publicly acknowledged. She was famed for her beauty and became known as the Lady of Beauty. Not a bad brand. Charles showered her with jewels and estates, and she used her influence to support charities. But her sudden death at just 28, possibly from mercury poisoning, reminded everyone that a mistress's life could be glittering one day and grim the next. Over in England, mistresses often played subtler roles, but no less important. Edward, Ivar in the 15th century, was notorious for his parade of mistresses, some of whom bore him illegitimate children. For those women, the king's favour could mean security for themselves and their offspring, but not always. Once Edward died, their children's futures were precarious at best, caught in dynastic disputes they never asked for. So what was life really like for a mistress? Imagine it this way. You had access to the king's attention and affection, which meant gifts, power, and status. But you also lived under a constant shadow. Everyone at court knew your fortune depended on one man's mood. You had rivals everywhere. Not only other ladies who wanted your place, but courtiers who resented your family's sudden rise, or churchmen who saw your relationship as immoral, or even the queen herself, who might quietly undermine you. And, beyond the courtly politics, was the deeper fear. What happens when it ends? A queen, at least, had her crown and her title for life. A mistress had only the memory of her beauty, the whispers of her enemies, and maybe a house in the country if the king was generous on his way out the door. The pattern repeats so often that it becomes almost rhythmic. A young woman enters court, catches the king's attention, rises swiftly into comfort and influence, enjoys a handful of years, maybe even a decade or two, of being untouchable. Then the king grows bored, or a younger rival appears, or politics make the mistress inconvenient. And then she's set aside, sometimes politely married off to a courtier, sometimes bundled into a convent, sometimes stripped of everything and left to wander. The lucky ones manage to secure enough wealth or estates during their prime to live decently afterward. The unlucky ones became cautionary tales. It's worth noting that mistresses weren't always acting on personal choice alone. Families sometimes encouraged daughters into these roles. A noble house might see it as an opportunity to cement influence. Marrying into the royal family was rare and difficult, but placing a daughter in the king's chambers, that was almost as effective, if managed well. Of course, that came with risks. If the mistress fell out of favour, her entire family could tumble down with her. And in some cases, the backlash was brutal. A father who once bragged about his daughter's influence might find himself disgraced, his estates confiscated, his name dragged through gossip as quickly as hers. There's a strange tension at the heart of all this. Were these relationships about genuine affection, or were they just transactional arrangements dressed up with roses? The answer, predictably, is a little of both. Some kings genuinely adored their mistresses, kept them for decades, and mourned them when they died. Others treated them as passing diversions. Some mistresses loved their royal partners. Others endured them for the sake of wealth or family, pressure. And that grey space between romance and transaction is what made their lives so precarious. A queen, at least, had the legitimacy of law and sacrament. A mistress lived in ambiguity, cherished but disposable. So here in part 1, we've settled into the shape of the story, mistresses rising in glamour, wielding influence in the shadows, but always balanced on a knife's edge of favor. As we drift further, we'll look at how their worlds evolved, especially in the great courts of the Renaissance and Baroque eras, where mistresses practically became political offices in themselves. We'll see famous names, women who defined fashion, toppled, ministers, or ended their days in lonely exile. But for now, imagine that early mistress's life. One day she's a lady in waiting with a decent gown and a future husband chosen by her family. The next, she's dining in the king's chamber, wearing pearls and hearing everyone at court whisper her name. And deep down, she knows this fortune rests on the flimsiest thing of all, the persistence of desire. By the time Europe drifted into the Renaissance, something interesting happened. Mistresses were no longer just shadowy figures tucked away in private chambers. They started becoming official, almost like a courtly position, half romantic, half political, and entirely fascinating. Kings began openly acknowledging their mistresses, sometimes even provided with formal titles, estates, and apartments in the palace. Everyone knew who they were. Everyone knew what they represented. And the queens, well, they mostly endured it. Some fought back, some ignored it, but very few could erase the reality. The mistress, in this era, was not just a personal indulgence. She was a public figure. Nowhere was this more obvious than in France. The French court practically perfected the art of the maîtresse en titre, or official mistress. A king might have several lovers, but there was usually one woman recognized as the principal favorite. Take Françoise Athénaïs de Montespan, the famous mistress of Louis XIV, the Sun King himself. She wasn't just a pretty ornament. For more than a decade, she dominated Versailles, known for her wit, her extravagance, and her ability to bend the king's ear. Ministers dreaded her opinions, courtiers begged her for favors, and her apartments became the real center of politics. But her downfall was just as dramatic. Whispers tied her to a scandal of witchcraft and poison, the notorious affair of the poisons. Whether she was guilty or not hardly mattered. Once suspicion attached itself, Louis cooled toward her. The woman who had reigned over Versailles found herself sidelined, eventually retreating to a convent. The lesson, as always: one day you're the center of the Sun King's orbit. The next you're just another shadow fading in the hallways. England wasn't far behind. Charles II of England in the 17th century practically collected mistresses like others collected wigs. Barbara Palmer, Nell Gwynn, Louise de Querouaille, each had her season in the spotlight. Barbara Palmer was bold and imperious, flaunting her influence. Nell Gwynn was the opposite, a witty actress from the London stage, beloved for her humor and common touch. People actually adored Nell, despite her position, because she was charmingly unapologetic about it. She famously told a mob not to attack her carriage, quipping, "Pray good people, I am the Protestant whore," a cheeky jab at her French Catholic rival. Only Nell could get away with that. But even in Charles's merry court, mistresses were temporary. They received pensions, estates, and titles when dismissed, but the emotional cost was real. To go from the laughter of the king's chamber to polite exile in the countryside was a fall few found easy. Some mistresses managed to leverage their position into dynasties. They bore royal bastards who, in some cases, were legitimized and showered with lands and titles. Think of Diane de Poitiers, mistress of Henry II of France in the 16th century. She was older than Henry, shrewd and cultivated. She wasn't just a passing fancy. She effectively shared power with the Queen, Catherine de' Medici. Diane controlled patronage, advised Henry, and shaped court culture. When Henry died, suddenly in a jousting accident, Diane's fortunes evaporated overnight. Catherine, long her rival, wasted no time banishing her from court. It's striking, isn't it? These women could wield near-regal influence while the king lived, but once he was gone, their power dissolved instantly. Queens endured, mistresses vanished. In the Baroque courts of the 17th and 18th centuries, mistresses embodied extravagance itself. They were fashion icons, setting the trends that rippled down through the nobility and sometimes even the common people. Take Madame de Pompadour, mistress of Louis XV. She wasn't just a companion, she was a cultural force. She championed the arts, patronized philosophers, and basically curated the French Enlightenment from her apartments. People mocked her behind her back. Of course, they always did, but her influence was undeniable. Her eventual decline followed the familiar script. Louis's affection cooled, her beauty faded, and she shifted from romantic partner to platonic advisor. To her credit, she managed that transition better than most. But still, her position depended entirely on the goodwill of a man whose attention span was notoriously fickle. The very visibility of mistresses in this era made them lightning rods. For admirers, they embodied grace and charm. For critics, they were symbols of corruption and decadence. Satirists skewered them in pamphlets. Priests denounced them from pulpits. Pamphlets painted them as serpents undermining morality and state alike. Yet despite the criticism, the system rolled on. Everyone complained, but everyone accepted it. Mistresses were as much a part of the monarchy as crowns and scepters. And always, beneath the glitter, the same quiet ending waited. Few mistresses grew old at court. Most were set aside. Some were married off to obliging courtiers, their beauty fading into respectable obscurity. Some entered convents, their silks traded for plain habits. A few clung on as advisors or companions, but those were exceptions. It's almost as if their lives were built around a cruel timer. The clock began ticking the moment they entered the king's chambers, and when it rang, their time was up. So in the Renaissance and Baroque courts, mistresses became institutional. They wielded cultural influence, political weight, and social prestige. But they also became lightning rods, envied and hated in equal measure. In the next stretch, we'll wander into the cultural perceptions of mistresses, how literature, gossip, and religion painted them. Were they temptresses, victims, power brokers, or just scapegoats for everyone else's frustration? But for now, imagine Versailles by candlelight. The king laughing in one chamber, his mistress presiding over another with elegance and wit, courtiers hustling to curry favor, and somewhere, in the shadows, the queen silently enduring. A triangle that repeated itself across centuries, glittering on the surface, fragile underneath. For all their jewels and silk gowns, mistresses lived in a hall of mirrors. The court saw one version of them, the common people another, the clergy yet another. They were never simply themselves. They were symbols projected onto, whispered about, turned into cautionary tales or glittering fantasies, depending on who was doing the telling. To the public, royal mistresses often represented everything unfair about the monarchy. Here was a woman, often of middling birth, suddenly clothed in pearls, riding in carriages, attended by servants, while ordinary folk trudged barefoot through muddy fields. It was galling, and so broadsheets and satirical poems had a field day. Nell Gwyn, the English actress who captured Charles II's heart, became an exception. The people actually adored her because she was seen as one of them. Her jokes were earthy, her manners unpretentious. her accent still flavoured with the London stage. People laughed with her instead of at her. But most mistresses weren't so lucky. They were painted as leeches, vampires draining the king's purse, the Scarlet Women blamed for taxes, famines, or the latest unpopular war. From pulpits across Europe, priests thundered against mistresses. They were living proof, so the sermons went, of sin at the heart of monarchy. A king keeping a mistress was more than a private failing. It was a national disgrace, an affront to God. Pamphlets described them as enchantresses leading rulers, astray, a familiar refrain that stretched from medieval chroniclers to Enlightenment moralists. Of course, the irony is that these same clerics often relied on royal favour, pensions, and donations, which sometimes came courtesy of the very women they condemned. At court, things were more subtle. Mistresses were gossiped about endlessly. Every new dress, every smile from the king, every late-night carriage ride became fodder for whispers. Jealous rivals painted them as schemers, while flatterers praised their wit and beauty. Take Madame de Montespan at Versailles. For years she was considered the very embodiment of grace and grandeur, but the moment rumours of witchcraft clung to her, she was reimagined as a dark sorceress, a woman who had bewitched the king with potions and spells. Reality mattered less than perception. Or consider Louise de Kerouaille, another mistress of Charles II. Because she was French and Catholic, the English mocked her as an agent of Rome, a spy wrapped in silk. Was she truly plotting for France? Probably not. But suspicion alone gave her the reputation of a traitor. Society loved to retell its stories as morality plays. The beautiful woman who rose high, only to be abandoned and die in obscurity, became a favourite fable. It soothed ordinary listeners to imagine justice delivered, even if only through the passage of time. A mistress in her youth was painted as dazzling, irresistible, and dangerous. In her decline, she became a pitiful figure, a warning against vanity and ambition. Satirists relished describing former beauties reduced to loneliness, the candle snuffed out. It wasn't always fair. Some mistresses aged into wealth and comfort. But those stories were less satisfying to moralists, so they rarely made the rounds. And yet, a few mistresses flipped the script. Madame de Maintenon, once a governess and mistress of Louis XIV, became his secret wife after the death of the Queen. She lived not in scandal, but in sober, near respectable power, guiding the aging Sun King toward piety. Her life blurred the line between mistress and queen. Then there was Agnes Sorel, mistress of Charles VII of France in the 15th century. She shocked contemporaries by wearing low-cut gowns, displaying a daring that scandalized chroniclers. Yet, she was admired for her intelligence and patronage of the arts, dying young but leaving behind a curious kind of reverence rather than condemnation. These women remind us that mistresshood wasn't one destiny, but many. Some fell, some rose, and some managed to reshape the role into something entirely their own. What strikes us, drifting through their stories, is how much of their lives were shaped not by private reality, but by public imagination. To be a mistress was to be constantly observed, constantly interpreted, like an actress on a stage that never went dark. You might picture them at night, long after the feasts and dances, when the candles gutter low, a woman alone in her chamber, the silks hanging quiet in the wardrobe, her reflection staring back from a silver mirror. Outside, pamphlets mock her, priests denounce her, rivals whisper about her. But here, in this small quiet, she is just a person, tired, a little lonely, wondering how long the king's affection will last. In the next and final stretch, we'll follow the gradual decline of mistresses as institutions, the rise of new political systems, the scrutiny of Enlightenment morality, and the eventual fall of monarchies themselves changed everything. But for now, let the images settle. Whispered rumors in palace corridors, mocking verses in the marketplace, and a woman's quiet sigh as she takes off her jewels for the night. Symbols to the world, but in the end, still flesh and bone, waiting for tomorrow's judgment. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the role of the mistress had begun to change. Europe itself was shifting. Monarchies faced new scrutiny. Ideas about morality, virtue, and even the purpose of kingship were no longer what they had been in the glittering courts of Versailles or the bawdy chambers of Whitehall. Mistresses were still there. Of course they were, but they were no longer unquestioned fixtures of power. They became more controversial, less tolerated, more shadowed by whispers of impropriety. The Age of Enlightenment prided itself on reason and moral philosophy. Thinkers loved to critique monarchies, and mistresses became easy targets. They symbolized luxury, corruption, and hypocrisy, exactly the kind of decadence philosophers railed against. Pamphlets accused them of draining state treasuries, influencing wars, and ruining kings. Some of these accusations were true, many were exaggerated, but the important part was perception. Mistresses were no longer seen as glamorous figures, but as outdated relics of a system under strain. France, as usual, provided the most flamboyant examples. Madame de Pompadour in the mid-18th century was both adored and despised. She managed to transition from royal mistress to cultural patron, commissioning art, architecture, and theatre. She lived as more than a lover. She became almost a minister in silk. But later, Madame du Barry, mistress of Louis XV, had a very different fate. At the Revolution, she became a symbol of royal excess. Dragged to the guillotine in 1793, she begged for her life, but to no avail. Her death marked not only the fall of the monarchy, but also the twilight of the official mistress as an institution. In England, mistresses survived into the Hanoverian period, but their status softened. Kings like George IV still indulged in affairs, but the role was less formalized. Society was moving toward a Victorian ideal of domestic virtue, or at least the performance of it. Mistresses became more discreet, tucked away from public view. They no longer strutted openly as rivals to queens, no longer wielded the same visible power. It was as if Britain, ever conscious of reputation, preferred to politely pretend such arrangements did not exist. By the 19th century, constitutional monarchies were spreading. Kings and queens no longer held absolute power. And with that loss of power, mistresses lost their place. Without direct control of armies, treasuries, or courts, a mistress could no longer steer the fate of a country. She might influence personal tastes, maybe even a cultural trend or two. But the age of mistresses shaping foreign policy or orchestrating ministries was gone. The role narrowed. Private companions, discreet lovers, sometimes close friends, the spectacle was over. Some of the last notable mistresses found themselves fading into the background of history rather than the spotlight. They retired into quiet estates, lived off pensions, or simply married and melted into obscurity. The world was different now. Newspapers and a freer press meant more scandal, not less. Industrial society shifted attention to new elites, bankers, tycoons, inventors. Monarchies, to survive, tried to model virtue, presenting themselves as symbols of family values. Queens and princesses became the faces of respectability. Mistresses were no longer compatible with the image. And so, one of history's strangest institutions slowly vanished. From medieval times through the Renaissance, mistresses had been fixtures at every major court. They had started wars, arranged alliances, toppled ministers, and bankrupted treasuries. They had been worshipped, feared, and despised. But by the dawn of the 20th century, they were ghosts. A few lingered in gossip columns, but the grandeur was gone. What remained was the faint perfume of an old order, a reminder of the days when kings were gods in their own palaces, free to choose a woman and place her above all others, until the tide of time carried both king and mistress away. If you close your eyes, you can almost see them. A procession of women in silks and jewels, drifting through candlelit halls. Some laughing, some weeping, some proud, some desperately lonely. They were symbols, scapegoats, power brokers, lovers. And, behind the myths, they were simply human beings caught in the strange machinery of monarchy. They remind us that history is not only battles and treaties, it is also relationships, desires, and fragile lives playing out under impossible pressure. The mistress was both exalted and expendable, elevated to the center of power, yet one whisper, one fading affection, and she was gone. So tonight, we've wandered through their strange world. From medieval scandal to Renaissance splendor, from Versailles intrigues to the Revolution's blade, and finally into the quiet decline of modern monarchy. Their stories are strange, sometimes tragic, sometimes absurd, but taken together, they are part of the tapestry of history, the human side of power, embroidered with vanity, longing, and fleeting luxury. And now, as the hour drifts late, you can let the images fade. The candlelight, the rustle of gowns, the murmur of gossip in shadowed corridors. Let it all soften and dim until only silence remains. Rest well and dream lightly.